Then keep it between us, she whispered. Keep it for the Emperor, and for the world he might remember. The word remember hung between them like a flame. When Lion left, she pressed into Mei Lin's hand a length of thread she had cut from a forbidden ribbon. For testing, she said, for proof that there is still color in the quiet places. Be careful. That night the small cell filled with the smell of camphor and tea and the faint, invincible perfume that is memory. In the hush, Scholar Lai Wei arrived with parchment folded into a small stack. His face was pinched from worry but brightened when his eyes found Mei Lin. There are precedents, he said, folding the parchment so carefully it might have been a silkworm's cocoon. He read aloud in the low, musical cadence of those who have spent their lives with texts. He cited an edict that allowed artisans certain exemptions for ritual objects, a minister in a previous reign who had argued for the protection of household crafts, a ritual rubric that described color as part of remembrance. His language worked in circles distant, classical phrasing that might not save a life, but which might choke a prosecution with ambiguity. They will try to make it a crime of the will, Li Wei said. They will say color invites feeling and feeling invites revolt. But ritual has always been the state's province. If we can frame this as ritual restoration, Mei Lin listened with an intensity that made the words feel like paint, possible pigments for a larger composition. She worried in equal measure about the law and about the ethical cost of the pigments, what Jiao had told her of forced extraction. The miners in the south who paid with their health. The documents were not medicine for everything, but they were a hinge. Li Wei pressed another scrap into her hand, a line of words he wanted her to incorporate into the work. She might later present phrases of ancestor veneration, of ritual that would mark her action as preservation rather than provocation. He spoke them as if they were colors he hoped she could blend. If we can give the court a language ritualized, sacramental, they may not call it sedition at once, he said. We need witnesses and form. We need the Emperor's presence and his recognition. His name held aloud can change a verdict. Mei Lin felt something in her chest rearrange. The legal argument was a scaffold, not a shield. She would need more than phrasing. She would need the Emperor to meet color on his own terms, to touch the thread of his life with pigment that soothed rather than jolted. That was when the parcel came. Eunuch Rong returned at night with a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. He placed it on Mei Lin's knees with the sort of reverence one uses for an offering. From the docks, he said. From Jiao. He could not come, but he sent this. The linen smelled first of the sea and then of something sharp ginger. Mei Lin unwrapped the paper slowly. Inside, nestled like a small altar, was a painted swatch, a rectangle of ground lapis, smooth, thin, and burnished. Even in the dim cell it seemed to glow a private sapphire. Around it, Jiao had left a note in his rough script, and a flattened slice of candied ginger tucked like a talisman. She held the swatch up to the light. The small square sucked light into itself and then gave it back as a small sky. It looked like a remembered place at the edge of the world, not the blue of lacquered tiles, but a blue like the inside of a borrowed memory. Mei Lin's breath came out as another sound. Eunuch Rong waited, his hands folded with the sort of patience courtiers learn where danger is constant, but care must be given anyway. Mei Lin read Zhao's short note aloud, keep the sea in your pocket, and do not forget to warm it with your palms. We are with you. The candied ginger left a peppery sweetness that seemed to strike the back of her throat with courage. She pressed the swatch to her forehead, then to her lips, an instinctive ritual of tasting what might be lost. For a moment the cramped room broadened. She could smell kiln smoke and brine and the soft clack of Jiao's tools. The swatch was not only pigment. It was a promise that someone still tended the recipes beyond the capital's reach. After the visitors left, Mei Lin set the swatch beside her journal and began the careful work of transcribing color by association. She wrote not in measured ratios alone but with images, lapis cold before sun, warms towards skin like a memory of seaweed. Temper with rice water sung in a grandmother's lullaby, do not boil. If wet enough, a small patel will accept the hue and keep it. Each instruction doubled as a mnemonic. She drew a tiny pictograph of a grandmother's lap and a stone, a shorthand that no magistrate could understand unless he knew the quiet language of craft. Imperial physician Han's visit came in the quiet hours before dawn. He appeared less like a man of the palace and more like someone who had been on the edge of sleep, two long eyes rimmed with fatigue, shoulders bowed. He sat on the edge of the straw mat and took Mei Lin's pulse, a gesture that belonged to a different intimacy. "You are not ill," he said after a moment, not unkindly, "but you have the strain of people who carry other people's grief. It is heavy." Mei Lin nodded. She had known that the physician would be careful. He had seen the emperor's small recoveries and had therefore to balance his oath to preserve life with the politics that surrounded the body of power. Han's presence was a small, fragile cleft in the armor of suspicion. "The emperor has had nights of better sleep," Han murmured. He spoke of the sea once more. He asked for a fan and then could not find it. "Whether it is the paint or the attention, I cannot say. But I will say this, whatever you do, be mindful of harm. The body is less patient now." It was not a reprimand but a cautionary prayer. Mei Lin accepted it. The physician's words made her aware of the scale of what she contemplated. Color could restore memory, but the mind and the body were not the same vessel. To paint badly on a fragile mind might be to jolt it into a final silence. She understood, finally, why they had all come, not to smother her in caution, but to gather the leaves for a final, precise fire. Each visitor carried a patch of the past, a ribbon, a petition, a swatch, a medicinal warning, and together they formed the outline of a possible action. Confined, Mei Lin had the rare clarity of having nothing to do but think. She shaped a plan in the margins of her journal, a scaled composition that could be finished quickly and with ritual accompaniment. A list of witnesses to bring to the hall so the act would be a ceremony rather than a crime. A modest set of words Li Wei insisted be recited that would frame the colors as ancestral ritual. She also wrote contingencies where apprentices might flee, which shipments could be burned, who would bear the blame if the worst came. She taught her mind the pigments as if teaching an apprentice who might be forced to carry on alone. Each morning she wove the recipes into memory, a cup of boiled rice water, cooled to the touch of the wrist. 2 grains of fermented root at the ash end aligned with a grandmother's cadence. The lapis must be warmed like a child's hand before it finds voice. She spoke them aloud until the concrete forms of ratios became stories she could not forget. When small visitors arrived, an apprentice son's letter smuggled in by a friendly eunuch. A brief message from Madame Zhou about banners being wired for testing. She folded them into the book and underlined key phrases with the corner of her nail. At night she dreamt in colors. Dreams were treacherous teachers, and in the morning she copied the best of them into the margins, a scallop of vermilion that came when one pressed a palm to a pillow, a green that hid in a child's laugh, a blue that tasted of candied ginger and blew like a bell. The act of writing made them less dream than thing. As the chapter of confinement wore on, the small acts of counsel and comfort gathered into a decision. Mei Lin had not yet committed to the final performance. She could still admit under pressure to any crime they would pin on her and live out some small, careful existence away from court. But when she set the swatch from Jiao beside the scrap of lion's crimson ribbon, and the words Li Wei had provided at their center, she felt a concatenation of obligations to the emperor who could briefly recover an old poem, to the artisans in the south whose songs filled Jiao's note, to Xun who had stumbled but still wanted to do good, to Jiao himself who would risk anything to keep recipe lines intact. The cell that had seemed a place of erasure was becoming the site of a small manufacture of courage. Mei Lin prepared her hands as an altar for something larger than herself. She practiced the motions of the final composition with a reed cut from the bench, painting invisible strokes on the air. Each movement was a rehearsal for the hand she would lay upon the emperor's sleeve. Each stroke had the possibility of reviving what had been lost or deepening the void. Her journal filled with lists that were at once technical and liturgical, materials, witnesses, syntactic phrases to be spoken in classical tones. And a final blessing Liwei insisted should be recited before pigments touched skin. She annotated it with tiny pictographs, an eye for the emperor's attention, a bell for witness, a boat for Zhao's supply lanes. It was less a plan than a map for a pilgrimage. On the last night before she was moved for the formal inquiry, Mei Lin lay with her cheek on folded arms and felt the small swell of loss like a tide. Outside the wall the palace slept uneasily. In the darkness she could hear the faint scraping of a broom and a footfall that was almost, for a moment, like the careful tread of someone searching for a lost thread. But she was not alone. The visits had left behind not only objects but the shape of a network. Each person who had stepped into her cell had taken some risk. They had folded their courage into her hands. She had recorded their sacrifices into the book that would survive whether she did or did not. And so, with a clarity that felt both like grief and like a kind of fierce gratitude, Mei Lin folded the journal closed, pressed the swatch Zhao had sent into the inside of her sleeve like a secret star, and breathed herself into sleep. In the pre-dawn hush, while the palace still negotiated between knight and ordnance, Mei Lin rehearsed the first words she would speak should they call her before the throne. Not defenses, not apologies, but a telling of small things, how a little blue could make an old man remember his father. She would offer witness through color, and if the court could not hold both memory and order, then she would choose memory. The cell door opened before dawn. Guards came with the formality of someone accustomed to reading ritual rather than human sorrow. Mei Lin rose, feeling as if each movement had been painted beforehand. The brief visitations, threads, petitions, notes, the ginger-sweet blue had not solved fate, but they had enacted a choice. She would take with her what could not be taken, the memory of recipes, the liturgy Liwei had given, the comfort of lion's silk, the small proof Zhao had sent. As she walked toward the hall where questions would be formalized and accusations sharpened into law, she carried in her sleeve a tiny piece of sea. The smell of candied ginger in her throat, and the quiet assurance that the work she would do, if it could be called work, was already underway in the minds of those who loved fragile things. The council gathered in the cell had not made her safe. It had, instead, made her ready. And so she went out, not certain of the day's verdict, but certain of the stroke she would make when the time came, an act that might be remembered as artistry or heresy, and that would force the court to answer whether color was luxury or necessity. The door closed behind her with the small click of a hinge, and the palace pulled its breath tight to hear what the morning would say. The great hall smelled of old paper and beeswax, a scent that had once been gilded with lacquer and fragrant oils. Now the lacquer dulled and the oils had thinned into memories. Even the candles seemed to speak in whispers, their flames small and careful, as if afraid to draw attention. The imperial days rose like a pale island under the high rafters. Carved dragons, their vermilion reserved for ceremonies, were washed almost the color of river stone. Above them, galleries of ministers and officials clustered in drab robes, black cloth folded like the pages of a closed book. Mei Lin walked between them with the gait of one who had kept her hands busy all her life. Her sleeves were darker than the rest, because of the stains that would not come out, and when she moved, the old habit of cataloging shade made her eyes count the tiny losses as if they were not her losses alone. She had been led in from a narrow corridor, the same path servants used to take votive offerings to the imperial shrines. The corridor had whispered to her of pages and fragments her grandmother's songs about grinding or into blue. the southern atelier where silk had been rubbed with pigments until they sang. Now those songs felt like contraband. At the center of the hall, under the carved dragons, Grand Secretary Shen rose as if called by the architecture itself. He was a man who measured silence the way a mason measures the straightness of a wall. His robe gave no sign of ornament. The black made his posture harsher, his jaw more deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it drew the syntax of his speech into the room like lines in a painting, precise, unyielding. "There are rituals and there are rebellions," Shen began, and the hall leaned in. "There is the orderly passage of rites that bind this empire, names rites, and the very pigments with which we mark our continuity. There is also the chaos of sentiment without governance." He paused, his hands folded, where they hung visible to all. "Mai Lin of the Imperial Atelier stands accused by evidence of trafficking heterodox pigments, substances outlawed after the Southern Purge. These pigments are not mere color. They stir memory, they bind communities, and in an age when a single spark can become wildfire, such stimulation is a weapon. Words unspooled like an indictment, sedition, heterodoxy, the stirring of nostalgia as incitement." The ministers around him nodded the way stones might nod. The Grand Secretary's logic had the cold arithmetic of someone who had seen villages hollowed by bandits and believed the ledger of loss could only be redressed by restraint. His voice painted pictures of past rebellions, how banners bright with forbidden red had once been a siren song, and asked the court to consider their responsibilities. He invoked famine, reflecting on the very origins of his conviction. In those hungry years, indulgence in pleasures had been a betrayal. Color meant excess and therefore unrest. Somewhere near the back, an assistant turned the page of a tali, and the minor noise sounded like a distant drum. The emperor looked small on his days, more like an artifact than a man, and then in a way that made the audience unconsciously hold its breath. He cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was thin as stray thread. "What is the measure of a memory?" he said. "Can we weigh a poem against a grain? A laugh against a ration? I do not know." The admission was a kind of thunder. It made even the Grand Secretary's careful features twitch in annoyance. Shen leaned forward, as if the emperor's uncertainty were a technical problem that could be solved by law. "Majesty," he said, "order is the only measure that scales for all. We cannot reconstruct what the past was. We can only shape what remains. Sentiment, while not without human merit, cannot be permitted to undo policy." Consort Lion rose before the court could be steeled entirely. She had come forward despite the chill of the hall. She moved with a gracelessness that was all hers, never the practiced carriage of someone seeking power, but the tentative steps of someone carrying memory. She cupped a small piece of embroidered silk in her hands, as if it were fragile as a relic. The cloth was small, a cuff saved from an old robe, its crimson faded toward rose, but still clinging to a ghost of glory. "Majesty," she said, and her voice was barely above a reed. This was his laughter. "He named the color for me once, when we were younger than sorrow. You who have governed so much, do you prefer a kingdom that forgets what it was, or a kingdom that remembers?" Wei followed her with his own eloquence, the scholar's cadence like water carefully poured. He spread parchments that bore bibliographic notes, precedents of pigments used in rites under earlier dynasties. "This is not sedition but ritual memory," he argued. "To strip the rites of their colors is to strip them of their mnemonic power. The rites themselves will become hollowed shells, their language empty." Grand Secretary Shen's reply was not merely argumentative, it was a confession of belief. "Memory without discipline invites faction," he said. "When people are allowed to reclaim private symbols in public life, they begin to see alternatives to the law. We must prevent the formation of competing loyalties." Mei Lin listened, the debate moving over her like a tide. She was expected to be the scapegoat for a philosophy that feared its own soft edges. She felt the court's eyes as if they were tools measuring a piece of wood. Is it straight enough? Is it useful? She thought of Jiao's weathered hands, of his stories about the southern artisans who had hidden recipes in hymns. She thought of the seam of southern silk that had first revealed the impossible blue, and of the way the emperor had brightened then dimmed at a painted bird. "Confess and be spared a life of hard labor under oversight," Shen said with the bluntness of someone offering a technical solution. "Refuse and your fate will be the example that dissuades others." It was not phrased as a question, but as a ledger entry with space for a signature. Silence pressed like a lid. Mei Lin rose when summoned. She kept her hand folded at her waist, the practiced posture of one who had spent her life learning the subtlety of brush and posture. She could have begged. She could have named suppliers and sent Zhao into the open to be taken. She weighed the names in her mind like pigment, considering their tones and the cost to the people who had already given so much. To betray them would be to blot out a palette entire. "If I confess," she said, slow and precise, she had learned from Lai Wei the utility of measured speech. "The recipes will die with enforced labor. The craft will be transported to a place where no one can read it without permission. Is that survival, or is that a slow state property of soul work? I will not be party to the Eresha." Her refusal was not dramatic, it did not rally the hall. But it did something quieter, it drew a thin, bright line through the grey. "Then you prefer your death to the Empire's continuity?" Shen asked. The question hung as if offered for ink to darken the margins. "If my death keeps the craft alive, then yes," Mei Lin answered. "But my hope is this, that memory is not the province of courts alone. I do not seek to dismantle the state. I ask only to restore what was taken because it remembers us." The Grand Secretary's mouth drew tighter, and for the first time a small fissure opened in his carefully constructed armor. He had not expected a defense framed as stewardship. He had anticipated pleading, bargaining, submission. A refusal with argument unsettled the arithmetic of his wager. Around them, ministers murmured. Some saw in Mei Lin's words a dangerous romantic. Others saw a person holding a piece of truth. The emperor blinked and reached for something, an echo of a feeling that the colors had once been more than decoration. For a moment his fingers sought consort lions, and he murmured a syllable no one could catch from the dais to the back rows. "Majesty," Shen pressed tactically, "if we permit heterodox rites to exist under the guise of cultural memory, where will we draw the line? Today it is pigment. Tomorrow, currencies of loyalty, the empire will unspool." The imperial physician Han, summoned by the courtiers as if his craft might adjudicate a moral argument, cleared his throat. He wore his learning as a necessary restraint. "The emperor's lucidity has been uneven," he said. "There are moments that look like recovery, but we have no guarantee. We must guard against manipulations that may exploit that inconsistency. I ask for caution." It was an appeal couched in professional tone, but caution became a cudgel in the hands of those who feared change. Eunuch Rong, who until now had been a small, almost invisible presence, stepped forward with a folded note and handed it delicately to the emperor. Rong's eyes met Mei Lin's briefly. There was an old kindness there, a memory of tea and whispered warning in early days. "Your Majesty," Rong said softly, "there is great feeling on all sides." The emperor took the note like a child accepting a new toy, and for a beat he held it as if the shape might settle a thought. When Shen asked whether the emperor would sign a sentence, should the court decree execution, the imperial hand hovered. "I do not like to see my people harmed," he said finally. "But I do not like to see the palace become the source of unrest either. I need counsel. Counsel." The word floated like dust motes through an empty room. Counsel was the currency of that place. Weight, precedent, books stacked like palisades against feeling. The ministers argued as if debating the placement of walls in some great building. Each advocated measures with a geometric logic. Some demanded immediate execution to set an example. Others, more moderate, proposed exile, forced labor, restitution, or neutralization of materials. Mei Lin was led back to her cell between sessions, a small space where light came through a narrow barred window, and fell in a pale rectangle across the floor. In that rectangle she had once allowed herself to imagine color, as a living thing blew a small flame, read a throat of laughter. Now that rectangle seemed like an altar at which judgment danced. Consort Lion visited her later, slipping the same embroidered cuff across the bars, as if to share its warmth. "If you must be an example," she whispered, "let it be one that teaches them what they have lost." "They will call me a heretic and a traitor," Mei Lin said, tracing the thread with a fingertip. "But the truth is smaller and crueler. I am just a woman who refused to let a recipe die." "You refused for good reasons," Lion answered. "You refused because memory matters." Lewei sent paper with layered marginalia citations of precedents of pigments used in court ritual dating back generations. He had the scholar's habit of making luminous the worn and forgotten. "There are things, even in a failing polity, that must be preserved as ritual," he wrote in a small hand. "Not for nostalgia alone, but so that remembrance can be used responsibly." Mei Lin set the papers beside her journal and, with the carefulness of someone who grinds ore into blue, she relearned the textures of her own choices. Confession would spare her life and seal the craft. Refusal would risk death and might preserve what she loved but only in fragments. She thought of Jiao and his parables, of the burned southern workshops, and the hands that had saved threads and recipes in song. She thought of Sun, who had already made a mistake in search of recognition. What would his life be if Mei Lin chose tortuous caution? She thought of the Emperor's small moments of recognition, how a bird's wing of restored lapis had unlatched a memory. The court reconvened in a later session as if deliberation were the slow painting of a great scroll. Strokes applied, observed, revised. Shen moved through his arguments as if layering a ground, first the problem, then precedents, then the mechanical necessity of a deterrent. He spoke of numbers markets calmed by austerity, festivals muted so that hunger might be remembered. His arithmetic comforted those who had lost kin to banditry and famine. Those who remembered chaos agreed with him because the past had taught them that mercy sometimes bred ruin. Yet other voices rose, measured and trembling. A provincial magistrate spoke of villages who had kept pigment recipes alive in fear and faith. A weaver from the palace banners testified about markets brightened when color returned. The hall became a place where anecdotes stacked like tiles, each one arguing for or against the sermon of austerity. When the hour drew finite and the ministers counted bones, Shen proposed the bargain as if it were the only reasonable solution. "If the painter confesses her crimes and relinquishes the names of her network," he said, "the court will commute her sentence to enforced labor and the recipes will become the state's to regulate. If she refuses, then death." It was a knife disguised as a ledger entry. The offer of preservation in exchange for surrender made the pages of Mei Lin's grandmother's songs feel like contraband to be signed away. That night, as the palace sank into a grey sleep and the candles guttered in lonely rooms, Mei Lin sat at the narrow window and opened her journal. She wrote down the names of colors along the margins, her hand steady despite the ache. She penned not recipes but small memories: a child's laugh on a summer dock, the sound of Jia's paddle in a harbor, the whisper of kiln smoke in a workshop at dawn. She traced letters with a charcoal stub, as if preparing a map that her fingers could recite later. In the small hours Eunuch Rong came with news. The emperor had not signed anything yet. Shen had pressed, argued, and prepared the edicts. Execution preparations were being made in case the emperor's hand fell to the ledger. "There is sympathy brewing among some aides to ask for exile," Rong murmured, "but Shen has momentum. He believes a decisive act must be made before sentiment sways more of the court." Mei Lin lay back on the thin pallet and let the ceiling become a wash of dim gray. She had to choose, confess and live a life in which her hands would work, but the craft would become a state commodity, or refuse and risk death while preserving, perhaps, the recipes hidden in the minds of those still free. She had always imagined her work as a stubborn act of relation, a way of keeping the dead and the living speaking to each other across a table of pigment. When dawn approached, the emperor summoned a few ministers